Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this week's Fireside Chat. Today, I'm joined by Philipp Kristian Diekhöner, who is a trust futurist, innovation strategist, TEDx speaker, and author of The Trust Economy. His work was instrumental to 2 Fortune 500 labs and one of Asia's fastest growing technology scale-ups. He works with Fortune 500s, C-suites, and technology disruptors on building a brighter digital future. Moving beyond the corporate and startup world, mid-2018, his work as a global keynote speaker and advisor spans over a dozen industries in 30 plus countries, including Bhutan and the Maldives. Philip is an alumni of the D School and was named a St. Gallen Symposium Leader of Tomorrow and World Economic Forum Global Shaper in 2018. He teaches a hallmark executive education course on transformation and corporate innovation at one of Asia's top business schools. That said, today he's actually coming to us from Italy. So good morning, Philip, and a very, very warm welcome to you to our Fireside Chats. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Jono. Indeed from Italy, which I learned through my trip, as I've only been part of Italy for the last 50 or so years. So anyway, there's a lot of discovery this year that we've all been going through. Hopefully some of it has led us into new insights, and thanks for also having the opportunity to share some of my recent thoughts, both on my topic and the world that's currently ours.
Yeah, really look forward to hearing what you have to say today. Let's just go back a little way and talk about, what you wanted to be when you grew up and why.
Well, this is a good one because there's been quite a progression. I've always had a creative streak, so that means design was and architecture were on the list. My parents weren't all that excited about it. And then the other side of me was always very analytical and strategic. So I also wanted to be a lawyer. And it bizarrely then happened that I negotiated a space in between, which is sort of studying business. But I have had a graphic and a branding freelance business for the longest time. In fact, if you ask me politely nowadays, I will still every once in a while whip up a design, just because it's a great way for me to express my creativity other than through words. So really, I've always existed at the intersection of creative and strategic, of left and right brain, and I find that a lot of interesting solutions come upon there when you combine those two worlds, and in fact, all the different perspectives that we have amongst us and amongst the human pool in this global world. So yeah, it's a long story, but I'm very happy where I ended up is a place where I can be both creative and strategic most of the time.
I think that it's a wonderful gift to be able to use left and right brain the way that you have throughout your sort of life's journey. And so how did you end up doing what you're doing now, and where did that sort of all start for you?
So I think what's interesting to appreciate here is that, however, as I'm born as a German, I went to international school pretty early. So as a matter of fact, combining that with living the last decade in Asia so far, I've basically spent my life as a third culture kid, more or less. And naturally you get exposed and used to a lot of perspectives. So what I realized was that I'd always been the guinea pig. In school, I was the first to do the IB in my school. I was then sort of one of the first actually to try all kinds of new things. One, to try the design thinking track that was offered by D School in Germany, which is some of it was really new. Then I went to Singapore Management University as well for a while. There, the design thinking program was also new. And throughout my corporate jobs, mostly in financial services and tech, I also realized that I was mostly the guinea pig. So basically the person tasked with new things, but also subject to new experiences and influences. And I've started eventually to just accept that as fate and thrive on it. And this is how I ended up in a space where, being tasked to create new things also ended up giving me the chance to work with now two of Singapore's most successful tech companies, one in the telco space and one in the financial services and insurance space. Now, the beauty of that is ultimately seeing something grow from an idea to ultimately a product, a service that changes lives and changes markets. And when you see that people's behavior and the industry convention has been changed through something that you were able to shape or co-create, that's really wonderful experience. And I've chosen to be at that intersection between, what is and what could be. And that is sort of how life brought me to two topics. One is the future and the other is trust. Because I noticed a couple things. First of all, if people don't trust you, you do not have license to create the future. However, if people do trust you, you'll be able to shape their current world and also whatever happens afterwards. And when people trust new products and new people, then their life changes as well. Or to put it into a slightly more relevant stance, at this current moment where we're all still experiencing the effects of COVID, when people stop trusting each other for whatever reason, legitimate or not, life gets very complicated and becomes full of friction. And that's sort of where I built my entire book and also insight on, is that a lot of corporations, they're struggling to deliver the value that they used to be delivering pretty easily because complexity all around the world is increasing and because they are struggling to trust at a very fundamental human level, both their customers and their stakeholders. And of course, that also includes their employees. So a lot of my work has been proving the effect that trust and building and enhancing trust has on corporate performance and on our own performance, and not just performance, also contentment and happiness, because in the end, that's what we all strive for, right? Ultimately.
Absolutely, it is. And I think, the topic of trust at the moment is probably one of the most relevant topics in terms of what's going on with COVID-19 and, people trusting each other, people trusting government, people trusting corporations. It's just, it's been an incredible journey from a trust perspective. So what's your actual definition of trust? How would you define trust?
So I think we've got to start from a baseline. The reason we're successful as humans is because we collaborate in complex systems. So we basically have achieved shared trust in things. When you think companies, you think faiths, you think monuments, it's all been a product of complex collaboration. So trust is the condition, the catalyst for that to happen. If you've ever tried working with someone you distrust, you will find that very difficult, if impossible. So trust is sort of like a catalyst for value. And that means it's a measure of the value that you're ultimately able to realize. If you price a product at $100,000, but people are only willing to pay $100 for it, then the value you realize is a function of the trust that people have in its value, not the price tag. So you can imagine it as simple as that, is the difference between what you intend to create and what actually happens. And that difference is usually a matter of how much people trust you, how much people trust your product and your service. So you can think of it as a multiple. In the ideal sense, it's a multiplier. In the worst sense, it's a fraction, right? So you could have a great business, but because people distrust it for whatever reason, your value creation is less. Or you could have a pretty standard business, but because you have a huge trust advantage, people might actually value it more. So you can see it as then ultimately one of the core, if not the core success factor in a company. So that's something I've advocated to everybody to manage because it's so essential. If you manage for capital and you don't manage for trust, it's like, kind of you're ultimately earning money, but you're not thinking about how you're spending it. You need both sides. It's that closely connected.
Yeah. I love one of your sayings, and that is, trust isn't everything, but without it, everything is nothing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, great sentence. Let's maybe talk a little bit about the trust economy and how do we leverage that in the right way, and maybe just sort of talk to our community about how it all works from your perspective.
So I think, when you look at the trust economy overall, we typically associate that with the sharing economy. And to be honest, when I wrote the book, that was initially also the example I used most. Now I've just finished my second book, which is a much more broader take also on weaving trust into the overall narrative. How does it really change us? How does it set companies, people, and nations up for success? But at the fundamental level, the trust economy is about finding ways with which to reduce the transaction cost of doing business with each other. So if you do business with a trusted associate or somebody you've done business with for a long, long time, you'll find that becomes a lot easier. There's a relationship that makes business easier. It's usually a win-win situation. Often when we do business with people we don't know, it's hard to know whether it's going to be win-win and worth our time. So the trust economy is an easy way of enhancing and building trust with strangers all around the world so that we can do business with each other. And this means ultimately the trust economy would hopefully soon in the future be a default for the economy, because the fundamental story arc that I build, especially on the broad scale, is that we've moved from tribal existences where we knew others based on bonds of trust and collaboration to industrial societies where we had to sacrifice some of that. And we ended up becoming these hyper connected societies that collaborated in some ways, but we also started distrusting each other in a lot of ways, locks, security checks, background checks, all of that compliance and paperwork. Even legal contracts, right? It's costing us trillions of dollars just in time and effort so that we only can do business together and with people around the world. Imagine all of that being streamlined. Imagine us, being able to do without some of that, or to make that entire load lighter.
Yeah.
That's sort of the story of how the trust economy becomes relevant to you as a business and as a person. Imagine your life becoming easier and you being able to do more. And ultimately, you becoming more productive because you can simply trust, and technology can really help us do that. It can make trust easier. If you think about it this way, you can leave the distrusting to technology so that you can focus on the trusting, which is what humans are ultimately built for. So that's the arc, how it matters today. And the idea is when you streamline trust, you collaborate dramatically more effectively. It's the reason why a lot of tech companies have smaller headcount, but significantly more impact, is because there's better collaboration. If your team collaborates better, you're going to be exponentially more successful. If you are able to reduce the friction with which you do business, just think distribution, all the different kind of aspects that you need to do in order to even sell your product, to have a business. Imagine all of that becoming easier because we can use things like technology and data to help us build trust with each other. And we can also recreate a precedent of trust. Then the world will become significantly better for all of us. And the existing science and research on the matter already shows that the most trusted nations are by far the most economically successful. So if you want to put it in a simple kind of, statement to put on your fridge, if you focus on trust over money, you will earn more than if you focus on money over trust. Mm-hmm. And that is something really to remember, because it takes a while for us. It's the same with purpose. It's the same with a lot of things that we've been talking about. It matters. Mm-hmm. And it's so important, but it's so easy to overlook.
Yeah, it's sort of, does that sort of apply in business to that, whole 80-20 rule, 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers, and that's very much about, the client picking up the phone going, I need X, I trust you, can you just make it happen? That's sort of, that's the ultimate goal in terms of a relationship with a customer, isn't it? What would be your advice to people out there that were trying to sort of get more of the share of that 80% that they're not getting, to actually build those relationships?
So what tends to be the case for all of us is that it's much easier for us to trust something when it's simple. So simplicity is one of those overlooked things in business. And yet when we simplify, we also quite naturally and inevitably focus. And that has to do then as well with this idea of establishing, or rather uncovering, excavating the actual purpose that's in the organization. So most companies, they have a purpose one way or the other, but some have forgotten about that altogether. And if you really want to focus and simplify and concentrate on where your value comes from, it probably helps to have your people aligned to at least one salient cause, like a least common denominator, a common ground. Because you need a common ground to trust upon. Otherwise, if you trust one thing and the other person trusts something else, then how can you ever achieve consensus, right? In the world, you see in a company that's not aligned, everybody focuses on what they want. And guess what? People want different things. So the alignment is going to be very little. In fact, that's probably why people fight, and there's politics and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Any of that thing, if you think it's necessary, well, maybe in your case it is, but we can all agree it's not particularly great for business. So when you find common ground, when people focus on what they collectively need rather than what they individually want, you realize that based on that purpose, you have a focus and you can actually simplify life. And mind you, it's always going to be easier to transform when your business is supposed to transform, to do that with simplicity. Because I've never met anybody who says, oh, if you make their life simpler, they said no. actually people want you to make their life simpler. If you can actually simplify a process, if you can remove some paperwork, and if you can, make people's day-to-day life easier and more productive by trusting them, by designing for trust, by also building a simple, purpose-driven entire structure in which people feel comfortable to contribute, guess what? They're going to be up for it. So the reality is, when you distrust people are interested in what you do, guess what? They will reciprocate the same way, because life is action and reaction. If you distrust people, they will distrust you. If you have no focus, they won't have any focus either. If you have no purpose, guess what? They'll respond. So you get the business that you expect to get. And if you believe that people cannot be trusted, if you believe purpose doesn't matter because money is important enough, if you believe that simplification isn't possible, guess what the answer is? That's exactly the world you'll get. And that's something, especially in my executive ed course, people start realizing this. They start asking about trust, because through the material alone, they start realizing that connection. And that's sort of, for me, a really wonderful experience when I don't have to talk to people about the significance of trust, but when they discover it for themselves through going through material around innovation, transformation, and figuring out a way to navigate in this world, when they start seeing those connections, that's when things become truly powerful.
Who would you, in terms of examples, who would you say, what corporations out there, or do you have examples of who's doing that really well from a trust perspective?
So I think there's individual businesses. It's always, all of you will run really interesting businesses. So when I highlight a business, it's basically whatever comes to mind right now. And I'm sure you'll be part of that list too. But just imagine in a hotel where you check in, people know, you might not even be asked to put your credit card because they know you. There's a sense that, mutual honorability. It's the simplest example. Or when you go somewhere in a restaurant, you maybe have an issue with your meal and people don't challenge you, but they just kind of replace it. And there's no sense of distrusting you that, okay, maybe you're just complaining to get something for free, because you get what you sow. Like, as in the way you treat people, your mental model of the world is reciprocated. And that particularly also applies to trust. If you look at a famous example, Nordstrom, their employee handbook has one line. It says, use your judgment, use common sense. That's all there is in it. And when you think about that, right, you realize just how powerful that is. Just giving people the chance to be treated like adults because they are adults. Imagine, just think of all the admin you go through on a daily basis where you have to prove your innocence, even though you're doing the perfectly right thing. Why is that? Why do we have to do all these things? Especially now during COVID, we have to fill out our contact details everywhere. And I know it's necessary, but imagine a world in which that were no longer necessary. Yeah. Imagine a world in which we could be sure that we can trust someone and that we can trust people collectively. Now, spoiler alert, there is a very important study on the subject, which is that in an overall benevolent system, a few rogue actors can actually spoil the entire system. So what we must make sure is that we establish what I call in any business a sort of minimum viable distrust. So meaning that we establish a sort of minimum viable fence with which we can create a safe space of trust. And when that exists between us and our customers, us and our employees, and us and our major stakeholders, we are going to thrive, and we're going to outpace every other business in our industry, because that is how it works. It's as simple as that. So coming back to any business in which you see that the default can be trust, in which a business, for example, says, we don't mind if you try our product and you decide somewhere else because we are confident that you will like our product. That's a gesture of trust. And I have a trust model where I look at hundreds of individual factors just to benchmark and assess that. Because if you think about it as a simple, flow, you could think about as kind of an up and down journey, like a customer journey. You'll find areas where you build a lot of trust. The customer will value that. That's an opportunity for you to create value. There's areas where you lose trust, for example, through bad service or through not knowing your customer or through speaking to them in the wrong way. That's where you lose trust, and that's where you lose value. So imagine how great your value creation could be, how much more you can do with what you already achieve by just removing the trust gaps, by just patching those, and by boosting the areas in which you have potential to create trust and value. So it's as simple as that. It's like a gap analysis for trust. It really helps you look at the micro perspective, because much as it's wonderful for us to talk about trust in the grand scheme of things, there's going to be the point where you and I talk about concrete projects, concrete challenges, and in financial services where I operate most, there are many of those challenges. For example, many players, they're faced with the challenge that they're trusted offline, like big banks. They're trusted as in their branch service, in their traditional service. But when they build a digital platform, they don't know how to build trust there. They don't know how to build trust in their online interfaces, because they're trying to use the same approach for what worked 100 years ago when branches were essentially proliferating to what works now. And wearing a suit and sort of serving somebody a nice coffee or wining and dining them may work offline, but it doesn't really translate online. So there's a new strategy you need. And I think, even if you only understand trust in a very, very sort of initial level, your job in the end is just to create more value, right? To do better for your business. So where I come in is ultimately, if I can simplify it for you, if I can solve your problems, whether or not you see trust as the core problem or whether you see something else, another KPI as the core problem, it doesn't matter if the solution is great, right? Yep. So my wish is, of course, that you take away from this that trust really matters. And as you begin to realize and internalize in how many ways that's true, you'll start seeing the connections. Most importantly of all, solving the problems matters, right? And this is my lens, this is my tool, and I use that tool when it's appropriate. When it's not, I use tools from my work in innovation strategy, as all of us, right? When we might be a lawyer, but when we go to the bakery or the supermarket, that skill may not be very relevant, right? We adapt. And I think this is the year of adaptation more than anything. So I hope that you're starting to see the virtues of trust.
I am, absolutely. What about the generational challenges that sit within that? Like I look at Gen X, Y, and Z, and, they've got a very different attitude towards trust and data. I mean, they've been brought up with it, whereas, us oldies have not so much. How's that going to work? And how do you sort of remove the friction associated with the generational gaps?
I think the intergenerational challenge is mainly one of leadership, because the expectation is different. So our generation and Gen Zs, in fact, nobody likes to be called Generation Z or Centennials or Millennials. I actually think that's just, we don't like to be called generational identifiers, but let's just take them for what they are. The Generation Y and Z tend to be used to trusting by default because they have this online trust economy at their disposal where it's easy to trust strangers. And so they do this very willingly and quickly, maybe too quickly, as some of the Gen X and baby boomers would say, and rightly so. But when they come to the workplace, they expect to be trusted up front because they are qualified. They want to prove that they're qualified, but they don't want to do it in an environment of skepticism. So their question will be to, why don't you trust me? I'm qualified, I come to this job, I want to contribute, trust me. And if you want, with a small responsibility, but trust me so that I can demonstrate that I do well. Then you have the older generations who are much less likely to trust by default, who have grown up in an environment where trusting by default was simply not the option, right? It was okay maybe in your favorite, maybe the place where you had a club setting or you knew people, but it wasn't possible in business. So that's a very different attitude we look at. And those, as managers, those people will generally expect trust to be earned. And they'll be frustrated by some new joiner coming in expecting to be trusted up front. Mm-hmm. So there's a core leadership and communication divide here. It's a friction that I've seen all across the world. This is one of those truly universal themes that I keep having people tell me about, as in how they're struggling with this from either this or that side. And resolving that challenge is basically understanding that whilst we all use data and technology, we default to it in different ways. As in, the younger the generation, the more we rely on it, the more indiscriminately we rely on it, the more quickly we're willing to build trust and adopt new things. And there we're seeing that the biggest missing point here is a mutual sense of understanding. And it's about finding common ground, that in fact, a world in which we pathologically distrust, like we see in some countries that are very, very restrictive on their current ways of trying to manage the crisis, they still find the crisis getting out of hand. We see the countries where, people work together with governments to jointly, preventatively curb the spread, that they're the most successful. And those are countries in which, there's a fair amount of trust in both, is that you need everybody involved. So you find that middle ground is usually the best way to achieve something. distrusting too much is bad. Trusting too much can be bad as well. And what I think is the biggest risk right now in the world is that we're seeing a young generation willing to trust indiscriminately, almost too much in too many aspects of life, and a generation that resists that, saying this is wrong by distrusting too much.
Yeah.
But both of these approaches, excessive distrust and excessive trust, they both have huge risks. And they also risk us as a society and as people drifting apart. That's the last thing we need when we have 5 generations in the workforce together who all need to communicate. They all come from different backgrounds. They might also be different nationalities, have grown up in different places. There is so much diversity. Do you really think that by taking extremes and drifting apart, we could eventually find common ground again? No. What we need to do is find a way to get people to reestablish that sense of what can be a shared belief, what can be a common ground. And this is for every organization really important, because when you just try a digital transformation, bringing on all these new technologies, the attitudes with which they will be used are vastly different. And in the worst case, you're creating a greater divide. So you really want to make sure that you think this through before you do it.
Okay. So 2020 will see humanity changed forever. Yeah. You've spent the last little bit writing a book. I think your book's called Reset. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
So do you want to talk a little bit about, I'm really mindful of the time as well, but do you want to talk a little bit about 2020 and your book Reset and how 2020 is going to change humanity forever? Because, some people will thrive and survive, and potentially some people have been given a second chance to really transform their business, and others will become obsolete. So do you want to just touch on that for me?
So we've, as I said before, we're a collaborative species. That's what makes us different from primates, is that we collaborate even without a transactional relationship in place. We collaborate based on future and social credits and social capital. So meaning we collaborate even when we could compete. At least that's what happens naturally. Yet in a global economy, we have been sold this idea that competition is better, and yet it isn't. In fact, we see that the most successful companies, countries, and individuals are actually significantly more collaborative. We see this, there's an HBR study on an individual level that partners in a consulting firm were more collaborative in crisis and therefore had greater revenue than those who actually stuck to themselves and tried to compete more fiercely when they faced the crisis. That was during the financial crisis. The takeaway is that in this crisis, we're seeing more and more that collaboration is significantly superior to competition. And we have been excessively competing with each other globally on all levels, from our school children all the way to our old age. So the problem now is when we start thinking of that, that is not a way forward. So the reset is about how we can rediscover what actually made us successful as a species, and how we can use COVID as a catalyst to remind us that some of the things we've been doing were overdue for change, and to actually find our way into that change. So this book is like kind of a greatest hits version of the different innovation and transformation things that we have been seeing personally in society and in business, and how all of that will allow us to essentially create a blank slate and build a new type of world in which we can all learn from this crisis, know what makes us great, and actually carry that forward into a future that will be brighter and will be more sustainable for all of us.
Do you think there'll do you think there'll be a divide of people that have that will embrace it and people that will just don't actually quite know what to do?
Isn't it such that whatever happens to be convention in the end, we don't know why it came about, right? We don't know why power like plugs or why different formats and adapters look the way they do. They just do. So in order to have that little bit of optimism, I think, for us to all catch on to it, we must make sure that whatever new standard we set right now is actually coming from a place of strength rather than a place of resentment. And I think distrusting each other, we've seen that has its limits. And we've seen that competing with each other excessively has its limits, because guess what? Now is a time where we all need to take care of each other. We can't keep fighting.
Yeah.
And I think COVID made that clear, because beforehand things were still okay. We could still move globally. Everything felt fine. Nowadays, I think the reminder is more evident as ever. And that gives us a chance to peel away some of the layers of thinking or maybe blind following that we have amassed, and just kind of discover and reframe into a new world order. And I know that then sounds really big, but then big ideas are needed to solve the big challenges that we have in this world. Think about like even things like climate change. Have we really tackled it? We've talked about it a lot, right?
Yeah.
And then just exactly. So just look as COVID as that final push, which allows us to find our dance again. That's how I see the world right now. And I think that sort of optimism will carry you through because we have to look at it that way. It's the best way.
Yeah, really nice way to look at it. You sort of moving forward in terms of industry, both, I suppose you as a keynote speaker, but also as a strategic advisor. What do you sort of see will be significant changes moving forward now?
So a big change is this digital by default trend, meaning that we sort of trust and turn to interfaces by default. Imagine sometimes there's a cab right in front of them, yet they check their app whether there's something available. It's like a default behavior, and it's also a behavior associated with simplifying things, because an interface makes things look so beautifully simple, and we get tempted by that, and we get we sort of channel our trust to that. So basically, if you're a great business, but your digital interface is less optimal, people might trust the worst business with a better interface. And this is something to really absorb, because the interface is going to increasingly symbolize the quality of the product behind it. We already know this with personal branding. There's been a surge of personal branding in recent decades. So basically, the personal brand is almost equated to the competence. We know that on a professional level. So that's going to be one really major trend. In industries, that means digitization is more than just a different way to meet your customers. It's basically a different expectation for what constitutes your product and your value. And the interface increasingly becomes the product. That's one. The other thing is that we're seeing specialization again. So there's a lot of businesses that do everything in a one-stop shop. But you can truly only do that when you are significantly differentiated, like Amazon, say. You can't do that when you're just one of many, because the margins won't allow you to do that anymore. So basically, businesses are going back to originality by specialization, simplification, and focus. And guess what? If you want to have a purpose in your business, it's easier to have a purpose about one thing, right? Mm-hmm. Easier to trickle that down to make people focus. So that's something we're seeing. Mostly I work with finance, tech, and public sector, but honestly, this applies to everybody. We're seeing this in retail as well. There's simplification. There's a sense of transparency and authenticity. People are more than ever before requiring and demanding to know where their produce comes from, whether it's food or whether it's electronics or whether it's services. They want to know who made what they consume, and they want to do more than consume. They also want to be involved in that conversation. So everything's becoming more of a dialogue. And guess what? That's a good thing. If you can handle it, if you want to listen to your customers, that's a good thing. But it also means that distribution will change. As in, you'll still need distribution, but probably your distribution strategy will adjust dramatically. Because what's happened to travel agents is, travel agents became what were once decentralized. They became one giant intermediary facilitated by data and tech. We can expect in some industries for a similar thing to happen. We know, for example, in finance that intermediaries still matter, but the way they do what they do has changed and is transforming. And this applies for pretty much all industries, because we all know that in order to sell big things, often distribution is still essential, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a good thing. It's just that some distributors are more aware of it than others. And we're most certainly going to see pressure on supply and value chains increasing, because what used to be just a matter of, being an intermediary is now much more a focus of what additional value can you add? If I, as an individual, can reach any person around the world with my product and service, my need for the intermediary is going to change, because I want somebody who truly adds value. I don't just want somebody who carries my product. I don't just want somebody who just gives me scale, because I can do that much more easily nowadays as well. So this age of empowerment we're in, it's going to change the way we look at business. It's going to change power dynamics. And my hope is that when trust is part of the guiding principle, that we get a fairer value distribution for everybody. That in these value chains globally, we're seeing a fairer distribution where people get a fair wage, where we actually are willing to pay up a fair price for a product. It's ironic that the persons making the product usually get the least of the proceeds. Anywhere in the world, whether you're a management consultant or a coffee farmer, it's the same thing. Yeah. It shouldn't be that way. This idea of corporate skimming of all the value, what sense does it make? Because in the end, we're all people, right? And in a great society, we'll agree that that's an equitable society. It's a society where we can all trust that we all deserve to be well off. Let's face it, right? So to me, that's No, I think it's fair enough, and that's about ultimately being more conscientious in what we do, and it's not a luxury. It's actually the way forward. Really, it allows us to do better what we currently do. So I like that, because rather than having to do something else less just because you introduce purpose and trust, now you can actually use these things to get better at what you do. And by being able to be more effective and generate more value, guess what? You have more value to distribute to the people that are involved in this. So that's how building on this principle will actually make everyone better off. And it requires a little bit of modesty as well, because if you and I are in a room together and there's $100 to be distributed, likely we'll distribute it fairly. So how come that natural human tendency has been overridden? Let's ask ourselves that question. And let's find a way in which we can have a more equitable, fair, and ultimately prosperous society, because a prosperous society is a happy one. It's not one in which some have a lot and others have very little.
Yeah, absolutely. Philipp, thank you so much for your time today. Incredibly enlightening. I could actually talk to you on this topic forever. With everything that's happened this year from a COVID perspective, what's something that you'll never take for granted again?
See, I think this idea of walking around without a mask is a huge luxury. The luxury of being able to have your face as it's God given to you, and to simply kind of take in the air as you always would. Who would have thought that would become a luxury in this part of the world, right? Enough. It's bizarre. That's one. I also think that it's connection, because when we were all locked down, like, connection was what kept us going, right? Mm-hmm. Like all the people that suddenly, were facing the same situation, it was connection that actually really made the difference. And it's so easy nowadays. You think, I can just connect with anybody, anywhere. I just download an app, I meet all these people. But guess what? It's a huge joy to have connection.
It is.
And the simple thing of just having a face-to-face conversation. I know it's old-fashioned, but let's be honest, we all like it. You and I'm sure you're yearning for live events as well. I'm certainly yearning for that. I've been doing virtual stages like perpetually all the time, and it's nice. You reach hundreds of thousands of people, yet let's be honest, being on stage, connecting in person afterwards, that's the real cool stuff. And yeah. I really, really, really wish that, and I know we will go back to that. It's going to be wonderful.
Yeah, it's the live events where you actually get that greater depth and the greater connection. I mean, virtual events, and I think events will absolutely come back and be a hybrid, and it'll be a combination of the two. But yeah, I can't wait to actually get back out into an actual live event. I'm really looking forward to it. So what about, you previously to COVID, you were an absolute avid traveler. You were traveling almost weekly. Is your traveling going to change now, do you think?
Okay, so the funny thing is, I've been in Europe for a couple of months, and I've been constantly traveling as well, because frankly now the luxury is that I can do all my global work from anywhere, and it's including the lectures. Like I would do lectures at 3 a.m. in the morning here, because that's just, but it works. It's wonderful. It's new challenges, new opportunities. Frankly, I think that I will move to a new equilibrium where it's sort of a little bit more settled. I was doing 300 days a year before that. That's a lot, even for people who, even for like some of the C-suites, I know that they travel a lot, but it's a massive amount. So I think that from going from extreme travel to very, very little travel due to COVID to a sort of now, hybrid, I'm going to settle with that as well. And I think that this hybrid mode, as you mentioned, and is going to help us with that, because it means that at times we can choose an opportunity where we'll spend a week at home and we can do that conference still. And then there's another time where we'll be traveling and where it's okay to sort of do another continent every day, as I literally used to do for a couple of weeks. And it's fine, in the end, as long as the speaking continues and it has a true impact, right? It goes beyond just the session. That's what makes me happy. That's what I want to see. And any author will tell you that writing a book is a commercially very, very stupid idea, because it makes you little money, unless, let's say, you're J.K. Rowling or some famous business book author. But still, it's mostly because you believe so strongly about a topic that you feel the need to write hundreds and hundreds of pages advocating for it. And so with keynotes is the easiest way to obviously get that. But that's the reason why I think now taking time to write a second book is perfect, because the first book was really like my initial overture for trust. The second book is about So if whether or not you believe in trust, we all believe in a brighter future. Here's how to do it. Here's how we can make it. And with that, I think, I think we will be speaking soon, live, hybrid. It'll be wonderful. I know that you guys have done an exceptional job of surviving and thriving in this time. And I think that in itself is, for all of us, the role models are all around us. We remember the companies that looked after us in this crisis. We remember those that tried to do well for us versus those that tried to only be interested in themselves. I remember vividly that Hyatt Hotels had this wonderful message around how their purpose was caring for people so they can be their best. And guess what? Their entire strategy and response has been like that. And their business will come back because people value what's being done for them, especially in times of crisis. And I think that's a wonderful note to end on, right? Perfect. When we do the right things now, we will reap what we sow in future. And
I really agree. And, it goes both ways. We really appreciate the support that we've had from our business leaders. The only way you can get through something like this is to actually do it collaboratively and do it together. So yeah, Philip, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Likewise.
And keep sending me photos of beautiful Italy.
It's gonna happen. All the best. Take care. Great afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Philip. Bye. Take care.